Mabel Trent sat in a cold holding cell, the iron bars vibrating with the upbeat brass music of the town's Founders' Day festival. Her hands were stained not with the charcoal dust of the mines, but with the blood of her own uncle. And her father's skeletal remains lay cooling in a shallow pit miles away. As the sheriff tossed her confiscated tapes onto a desk, the only evidence of a 30-year massacre, he leaned in and whispered, "Your mother sends her regards, Mabel. Some secrets were meant to stay buried." The realization hit her harder than the tire iron that had shattered her ribs just hours before. The very woman who tucked her in at night had been the one to lure her father to his death. And now, the funeral home was being bulldozed to erase the crime scene forever. With only 60 minutes until the demolition began and her freedom stripped away, Mabel clutched a hidden mortician's tool in her palm. She didn't just need to break out. She had to figure out why her mother's name was the last one whispered on the tapes. The hammer struck the porch post with a dull, final thunk, the sound vibrating through the warped floorboards beneath Mabel's slippers. She didn't need to read the notice. Its weight alone told her everything. The ink bled slightly where the rain had caught it, smudging the bank's logo into something indistinct, like a half-remembered dream. She wiped her palms on her apron, the fabric stiff with old starch and the faint metallic tang of embalming fluid that never quite washed out. Inside the prep room, the humidity clung to the walls like a damp shroud. Mabel stood over a pauper's casket, the pine planks rough and unyielding under her calloused fingers. The air was thick, a stagnant soup of formaldehyde and the sweet, cloying rot of lilies starting to turn brown in the viewing room next door. Every movement felt sluggish, as if she were wading through river mud. She ran a plane over the lid of the casket, the curls of wood falling like shavings of bone. Each stroke was a desperate attempt to maintain a shred of professional dignity, while the world outside systematically dismantled her life. The bank appraiser's SUV sat in the driveway like a vulture, and the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of the staple gun outside felt like nails being driven into her own coffin. She was 37, but in this light, with the coal dust of Blacksburg etched into the lines around her eyes, she looked 50. She set the plane down, her breath hitching in the quiet. The ledger lay open on the scarred workbench, a record of a slow-motion disaster. She traced a finger down the columns of red ink, the numbers blurring into a jagged mess. Business debts to the chemical suppliers, rising heating costs for a drafty Victorian monstrosity, and the ever-present, suffocating weight of the mortgage. It wasn't just about the wood and the stone. It was about Lily. Her daughter was upstairs, likely drawing in a sketchbook with blunt crayons, unaware that the ceiling over her head was being sold out from under them. Mabel's knuckles cracked as she wrung her hands, the skin raw and peeling. She needed a way out, a miracle, or perhaps just a clean way to lie to the bank for another 30 days. The desperation was a physical heat in her chest, sharper than the summer swelter. She couldn't stay in the prep room, not with the smell of failure rising from the ledger. She needed to prove the building had historical value, something to trigger a stay of execution from the Historical Society or a specialized grant. She grabbed a flashlight and headed for the narrow, winding stairs that led to the attic. The wood groaned under her weight, a familiar complaint from a house that had seen too much grief. The air grew thinner and hotter as she climbed, the scent of mothballs and ancient dust replacing the chemical tang of the lower floors. The attic was a graveyard of things forgotten. Broken chairs, rolls of black crepe paper from the 20s, and stacks of records Mabel's father had kept before the mine took him. She began to sift through the crates, her movements frantic, tossing aside moldering ledgers and rusted tools. She was looking for a deed, a charter, anything with a seal that whispered of permanence. The flashlight beam cut through the gloom, dancing over a stack of crates in the far corner, tucked beneath the eaves where the roof sloped dangerously low. There, behind a pile of moth-eaten funeral shrouds, sat a shoebox. It was plain, tied with a bit of frayed twine, looking utterly ordinary amidst the Gothic clutter. Mabel pulled it into the light, the cardboard brittle in her grip. She expected old receipts or perhaps a lock of hair. But when the lid came away, she found rows of cassette tapes. They were labeled in a shaky, familiar hand, her grandmother Eula's handwriting. Eula had been a woman of sharp silences and hidden bottles, a widow who ran this house with a rod of iron until the day she simply stopped breathing. Mabel picked up a tape, the plastic cool against her palm. These weren't business records. These were voices, waiting in the dark for decades. She brought the box down to the office, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She found an old player in the bottom drawer of her father's desk. The batteries corroded, but the AC adapter still functional. With trembling fingers, she slotted the first tape in and pressed play. The hiss of magnetic tape filled the room, followed by the rasping, whiskey-soaked voice of Eula Trent. It sounded like gravel being turned over in a shovel. If you're hearing this, Mabel, it's because the silence finally got too loud. The recording began. Eula didn't mince words. She spoke of the night Daniel Trent, Mabel's father, didn't come home. The company had called it an accident, a tragic collapse of a weak seam. But Eula's voice turned to ice as she described the truth. Daniel had found evidence of safety violations that would have shuttered the mine for good. He was going to the authorities. He was murdered. His death staged in the dark, miles below the earth. Oh, Mabel sat frozen, the revelation of a corporate conspiracy chilling the sweat on her skin. The shock didn't last. It was quickly replaced by a cold, sharpened focus. If the company had killed her father, they had spent 30 years stealing her life. She grabbed a legal pad and began to transcribe, the pen scratching furiously across the paper. She needed a paper trail. She needed the words out of the air and onto the page where they could be used as a weapon. Every name Eula whispered, foremen, executives, crooked deputies. Mabel etched into the yellow paper. This was her leverage. The funeral home wasn't just a business anymore. It was a crime scene, 30 years in the making. She worked feverishly, the flickering fluorescent light of the office casting long, skeletal shadows. She was no longer just a mortician. She was a woman digging up a grave that the coal company thought was sealed forever. The back door chimes jangled, a harsh sound that made Mabel jump, her pen skidding across the pad. She didn't have time to hide the tapes before Uncle Silas stepped into the office. He was a broad man, his neck thick as a bull's, wearing a company jacket that smelled of stale tobacco and grease. He didn't knock. He never did. He looked at the shoebox on the desk, his eyes narrowing, the pale blue of his pupils turning hard as flint. "Mabel," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I heard you were poking around the rafters. Some things are better left in the dust." He reached for the box, his massive hand hovering over the tapes. He wasn't just a relative. He was the company's attack dog, a man who had traded his brother's memory for a steady paycheck and a title. Mabel pulled the box back, her jaw setting. "These belong to the family, Silas, not the company," he didn't argue. Silas wasn't a man for words when muscle would suffice. He lunged across the desk, his fingers snagging the edge of the shoebox. Mabel twisted away, the chair screeching against the floorboards as she bolted for the stairs. She wasn't thinking about the bank or the morgue. She was thinking about the truth. Silas pursued her, his heavy boots thudding on the Victorian wood, his breath coming in ragged, angry grunts. They reached the attic, a space now transformed into a battlefield of shadows. He cornered her near the stack of crates where she'd found the box. The air was stifling, thick with the smell of old paper and the scent of Silas's sweat. He shoved her, his strength immense, and Mabel's shoulder hit a stack of crates with a sickening crunch. The world tilted, the flashlight rolling across the floor, casting the ceiling into a dizzying spin of light and dark. "Give it over, girl," Silas growled, stepping into the light. He looked older, his face a roadmap of scars and compromises. Mabel's hand brushed against something cold and heavy on a nearby shelf, a brass funeral urn, ornate and solid. As Silas reached for her throat, she swung with everything she had. The metal connected with the side of his head with a dull clack. Silas staggered, a dazed, glassy look crossing his eyes as he slumped against a wardrobe. He wasn't out, but he was slowed, the blood beginning to leak from a cut above his ear. Mabel didn't wait to see if he'd get up. She grabbed the shoebox and scrambled down the stairs, her heart a frantic bird trapped in her chest. She reached the main floor, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Silas was cursing upstairs, the sound of furniture being shoved aside, echoing through the vents. She needed a place to hide the tapes, somewhere he wouldn't dare look. Her eyes landed on the heavy metal door of the morgue. Inside, a body lay under a pale sheet. Old Mr. Henderson, waiting for his viewing tomorrow. He was cold, still, and utterly indifferent to the wars of the living. Mabel hurried to the cooling table, her hands shaking as she lifted the edge of the linen shroud. She tucked the shoebox beneath the crook of the corpse's arm, smoothing the fabric back down. Silas was superstitious. He hated the dead, hated the way they looked back at you with nothing in their eyes. He wouldn't touch a shroud, not even for the company. It was the only sanctuary she had left. The front door slammed, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the house. Silas was gone, but the silence he left behind was heavier than his presence. Mabel leaned against the cold tile of the morgue wall, her legs finally giving out. She slid to the floor, her face buried in her hands. The house felt different now, haunted not by ghosts, but by the living. A floorboard creaked in the hallway, and she looked up to see her mother, Martha, standing in the doorway. Martha looked impeccable as always, her blonde hair set in soft waves, a pastel sweater draped over her shoulders. But her eyes were flat, the green of them dull as moss. "You shouldn't have hit him, Mabel," Martha said softly, her voice devoid of comfort. "You should have just let him take them." Mabel stared at her mother, the realization dawning like a slow, cold sunrise. "You knew," Mabel whispered, her voice cracking. "You knew what was on those tapes. You knew about Dad." Martha didn't flinch. She simply smoothed her skirt, her manicured nails catching the light. "I did what I had to do to keep this roof over your head," Martha replied, her voice as precise as a ledger entry. "Eula was a bitter woman. She wanted to burn the world down, but I wanted a life for you." Mabel felt a surge of nausea. For 20 years, her mother had been a silent partner in a murder, systematically erasing the paper trail, playing the grieving widow while cashing the checks that kept the funeral home afloat. The lines were drawn now. Mabel was alone in a house built on blood money, surrounded by enemies who shared her last name. The following morning brought a different kind of cold. The coal company didn't waste time with subtle threats anymore. A courier arrived at dawn, his face a mask of practiced indifference, handing Mabel a formal notice. The company was terminating its long-standing service contract with the Trent Funeral Home, effective immediately. This was the final blow to the ledgers. The company accounted for 70% of her burials. Without that income, the bank wouldn't wait for the auction. They'd simply lock the doors. Mabel stood on the porch, watching the courier's car disappear into the gray mist of Blacksburg. They were starving her out, cutting the oxygen to the room until she had no choice but to gasp for whatever terms they offered. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the Victorian house sounded like a footstep. It was after midnight when the smell hit her. Not the cloying scent of lilies or the sharp bite of formaldehyde, but the acrid, terrifying stench of wood smoke. Mabel bolted from her bed, her heart hammering. She ran down the stairs, the air growing thick and hazy. The fire had started in the embalming room, orange tongues of flame licking at the white-tiled walls, feeding on the chemicals in the old wooden cabinetry. "The tapes!" she gasped. The thought a physical jolt. She dove into the morgue, the heat already searing the hair on her arms. She grabbed the cooling corpse of Mr. Henderson, the weight of the man immense, and dragged the gurney toward the side exit. The flames roared behind her, a hungry beast. But she didn't let go until she was out in the damp grass of the yard, the shoebox still tucked securely beneath the shroud. By the time the volunteer fire department arrived, the embalming room was a blackened husk. Mabel stood in the driveway, wrapped in a soot-stained blanket, watching the embers glow like angry eyes in the dark. The fire chief, a man who had known her father, shook his head as he walked over. "Faulty wiring, Mabel. These old places are tinderboxes." He didn't look her in the eye. He knew, just like everyone in town knew, that wires didn't jump to life just because the coal company was angry. And then came the second blow. A representative from the Blacksburg Savings and Loan arrived as the sun began to peek over the hills. Because of the increased risk and the damage to the collateral, the bank was moving the foreclosure auction forward by 2 weeks. The ticking clock in Mabel's head suddenly doubled its pace, a frantic, rhythmic reminder that she was losing everything. The terror of the fire was nothing compared to the look on Lily's face when she came home from school that afternoon. Her daughter's eyes were red-rimmed, her backpack dragging on the floor like a lead weight. "The boys said you're a grave robber, Mama," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "They said the company is going to take me away because you're crazy." The children of the executives, the ones who lived in the houses with the paved driveways, had been coached well. They had turned the schoolyard into a battlefield, targeting Lily with the precision of a corporate memo. Mabel pulled her daughter into a tight embrace, the scent of smoke still lingering in her own hair. The rage that had been simmering in her gut finally boiled over. They could take the house, they could burn the business, but they would not touch her child. The threats moved from the schoolyard to the home. Mabel woke in the dead of night to the sound of the front door clicking shut. She grabbed a heavy flashlight and crept down the stairs, her breath held tight. The foyer was empty, the front door standing wide open to the cool mountain air, the moonlight spilling across the Persian rug. There was no one in the shadows, no sign of an intruder. But when she walked into Lily's room, her blood turned to ice. On her daughter's pillow, just inches from the girl's sleeping face, sat a single jagged lump of coal. It was a signature, a silent promise that the company could reach them anywhere, at any time. The message was clear: silence or the mine. Desperation drove her to the sheriff's office the next morning. Roy Callahan was a man of sharp angles and dull eyes, his uniform pressed so tight it looked like it might snap. Mabel laid the transcribed tapes on his desk, her voice shaking as she described the fire, the threats, and the murder of her father. Roy didn't look at the papers. He just tapped his fingers on his belt near his holster. "Mabel, Eula was a sick woman at the end. Everyone knows that, he said, his voice a slow, patronizing drawl. You bring me a recording of a dead woman's ramblings, and you expect me to arrest the men who keep this town fed. I need a body, Mabel. I need physical evidence, or I need you to go home and stop making trouble. He looked at her then, and for a second, the mask slipped. He wasn't just indifferent. He was terrified. The company owned him just as surely as they owned the coal in the ground. She left the station feeling like a ghost, her footsteps hollow on the cracked sidewalk. She was walking to her car in the secluded lot behind the hardware store when the shadows moved. Two men, their faces obscured by dark masks, stepped out from between the parked trucks. They didn't speak. One swung a tire iron, the metal whistling through the air. Mabel dodged, the blow catching her shoulder and sending a jolt of white-hot pain through her arm. She scrambled backward, her heels skidding on the gravel. They wanted the location of the tapes, and they were willing to break every bone in her body to get it. She managed to find her keys, swinging her heavy brass keychain like a flail, catching one of them across the bridge of his nose. She didn't wait to see the blood. She bolted for the funeral home, the only place she knew how to fight. They followed her, their boots crunching on the driveway. Mabel didn't go through the front door. She led them toward the garage, the heavy concrete structure where the hearse was kept. The air inside was cool and smelled of oil. She ducked behind the workbench, her heart a drum in her ears. As the first man stepped inside, his silhouette framed against the moonlight, Mabel reached for the control panel of the heavy motorized garage door. With a mechanical groan, the steel slats began to descend. The thug realized too late, his partner shouting a warning from outside, but the door slammed shut, the locking pins engaging with a finality that made the floor vibrate. She had isolated them, turning her familiar sanctuary into a trap. The second man was already inside, having slipped through the side door. He lunged at her, his hands outspread. Mabel didn't have a tire iron, but she had the tools of her trade. She grabbed a chemical fire extinguisher from the wall, pulled the pin, and unleashed a blinding cloud of white powder directly into his face. The man screamed, clutching his eyes, the chemical spray filling his lungs. Mabel didn't hesitate. She shoved past him, her boots echoing on the concrete as she fled into the main house, locking the reinforced metal door behind her. She was shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But she was alive. And for the first time, she had fought back and won. She found Silas waiting in the hallway, standing near the charred entrance to the embalming room. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked tired, his broad shoulders sagging. "You're a fool, Mabel," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You think you're saving his memory? This place, this house, the equipment, your tuition, it was all paid for with blood money. The company didn't just kill him, they bought us. For 20 years, every burial you performed was a gift from the men who put your father in the ground." The words hit her harder than the tire iron. Her entire life was a monument to silence, a gilded cage built from the profits of a cover-up. She looked at the peeling wallpaper, the worn rugs, and saw only the rot beneath. The crisis of conscience was a physical weight, a nausea that settled deep in her marrow. She had fought so hard to save the funeral home, thinking she was protecting her father's legacy, only to find she was guarding a tomb of lies. She sat on the floor of the darkened hallway, the scent of smoke still cloying, and felt the last of her illusions shatter. But as she looked up at the stairs where Lily was sleeping, the despair turned into something harder, something colder. If the company had bought her past, she would damn well make them pay for her future. She wouldn't just save the house, she would burn their reputation to the ground. She began to formulate a plan, a desperate, high-stakes gamble. The Founders' Day festival was in 3 days. The entire town would be there, the media would be there, and the truth would finally have an audience it couldn't ignore. The following morning, the coal company escalated their legal warfare. A process server arrived with a massive defamation lawsuit, a document so thick it felt like a brick. By noon, Mabel's bank accounts were frozen, and a court order had been issued to halt all funeral home operations. She was paralyzed, unable to even buy the chemicals needed for her work. But the final indignity came an hour later. Creditors and bailiffs swarmed the house during a viewing service for a local grandmother. They began to tag the embalming equipment, the mahogany chairs, even the velvet curtains, while the grieving family watched in horrified silence. Mabel stood in the foyer, her face a mask of stone, as her professional reputation was dismantled piece by piece. She was being stripped bare in front of the town. But they had missed one thing. They hadn't found the map. It was tucked inside a hidden compartment of a cassette tape case she hadn't transcribed yet. The map was hand-drawn, the ink faded, but the lines precise. Her father's hand. It showed a specific coordinate on company property, a place far from the main seams, located in the old Blackwood vein. Eula had never mentioned this in the tapes. Perhaps she hadn't known. But Daniel Trent had left a trail. Mabel studied the landmarks, the twin oaks, the rusted ventilation shaft, the jagged rock face. It was a disposal site, a place where the earth was too unstable for mining but perfect for hiding a body. She knew then that the tapes were only the beginning. She needed the physical proof, the one thing Sheriff Callahan couldn't ignore. Under the cover of a moonless night, Mabel drove her old truck to the edge of the dormant mine. The air was cold, smelling of damp earth and ancient, trapped gases. She carried a flashlight and a heavy spade, avoiding the main roads where company security patrols roamed like wolves. The mine entrance was a jagged black maw, the timber supports groaning under the weight of the mountain. She stepped inside, the darkness swallowing her whole. Every drip of water sounded like a footstep, every rustle of a rat like a whispered threat. She followed the map, crawling through narrow, unstable tunnels where the ceiling brushed her back, her breath hitching in the suffocating stillness. She was walking into the heart of the beast that had swallowed her father. She found the spot near the end of a collapsed drift. The earth was softer here, disturbed. She began to dig, her muscles screaming, the sweat stinging her eyes. 2 feet down, her spade struck something that wasn't rock or wood. She cleared the dirt with her hands, her fingers trembling. First, a scrap of rotted denim. Then, the dull glint of metal. She pulled it free. A silver watch. The crystal cracked, the back engraved with the initials DT. Beneath it lay the skeletal remains of the man she had waited 20 years to find. The proof was undeniable. She tucked the watch into her pocket, her tears carving tracks through the coal dust on her face. She had him. She finally had him. You always were a persistent girl, Mabel. The voice came from the shadows, cold and hollow. Uncle Silas stepped into the light of her flashlight, the company foreman standing beside him. The foreman held a heavy iron wrench, his eyes flat and murderous. "We put a GPS tracker on your truck the day of the fire," Silas said, his voice tinged with a strange, weary regret. "We knew you'd lead us right to it. Some things are meant to stay buried, for the good of the town." The foreman stepped forward, the wrench raised. They didn't want the watch. They wanted to make sure Mabel Trent never left the Blackwood vein. The struggle was a blur of violence and shadows. The foreman lunged, and Mabel swung her spade, the metal clanging against the wrench. They rolled on the uneven floor, the unstable ceiling groaning above them as debris began to rain down. The mine was waking up, the vibrations of their fight shaking the rotted timbers. Mabel managed to land a kick to Silas's knee, sending him tumbling into a shallow pit. She used a heavy piece of timber to block the foreman's path, the wood splintering as he slammed against it. As a section of the roof collapsed between them, Mabel scrambled toward the surface, the air growing sweeter with every step. She burst out into the night, the watch clutched in her hand, leaving her pursuers trapped behind a wall of fallen rock. She drove back to the funeral home, her mind racing, only to find the sheriff's cruiser idling in her driveway. Roy Callahan didn't wait for her to speak. He stepped out of the car, his face set in a grim mask, and held up a pair of handcuffs. "Mabel Trent, you're under arrest for financial fraud and grand larceny," he said, his voice loud enough for the neighbors to hear. She tried to show him the watch, tried to tell him about the mine, but he shoved her against the car, the metal cold against her cheek. He didn't want the truth. He wanted her silenced before the festival began. He tossed her into the back of the cruiser, ignoring her pleas, and drove her toward the station while the first sounds of the parade music began to drift through the streets of Blacksburg. He locked her in a holding cell at the back of the station, the air smelling of urine and stale coffee. Through the small, barred window, she could see the flashes of the fireworks and hear the distant cheers of the crowd. The sheriff had confiscated the tapes and the watch, her only evidence now sitting in a locker he controlled. She was trapped, her reputation destroyed, her evidence gone, while the town celebrated the very men who had built their empire on her father's bones. The silence of the cell was absolute, a mocking reminder of the 20 years she had spent in the dark. But as she sat on the narrow metal bunk, her eyes traced the cracks in the cell wall. The building was old, built in the same era as the funeral home cellar, likely by the same company using the same substandard materials. She recognized the structural flaws, the way the mortar crumbled under a determined touch. She reached into the hem of her sleeve, where she had concealed a small trocar tool, a sharp, surgical instrument used for aspiration. It was a tool of her trade, precise and deadly. She began to work on the outdated locking mechanism of the cell door, her fingers moving with the surgical grace she had practiced for a decade. The lock was stubborn, but Mabel was more so. With a soft click, the bolt slid back. She stepped into the hallway, her heart a frantic rhythm. She was nearly to the service entrance when she saw the bank appraiser walking toward the sheriff's office. He didn't see her in the shadows, but she heard him speaking to a deputy. "The demolition crew is on site," he said, checking his watch. "The Trent place comes down in 60 minutes. Orders from the board." The news was a physical blow. They weren't just taking her home. They were erasing the crime scene. She slipped out the door and into the cool night air, her mind a whirlwind of static and rage. She had 1 hour. 1 hour to save her history and destroy theirs. She ran to a hidden stash behind the old tool shed near the station, a place where she'd hidden her daughter's smartphone. On it were the digital backups of the tapes she'd secretly recorded while transcribing. She hadn't told anyone, not even Martha. In the age of the company, she'd learned that the only safe secret was the one you kept in your own pocket. The phone was her portable, indestructible weapon. She checked the battery, 80%. It was enough. She began to sprint toward the town square, her boots thudding on the asphalt, the lights of the festival glowing like a funeral pyre in the distance. The square was a sea of people, the air thick with the smell of funnel cakes and the sound of a bluegrass band. Mabel moved through the crowd like a ghost, using the colorful decorations and the press of bodies to shield her from the company's security guards patrolling the perimeter. She reached the back of the main stage, where the town's dignitaries were preparing for the memorial service. She saw the sound booth, a small wooden structure tucked behind the curtains. The technician inside was distracted, flirting with a girl near the steps. Mabel slipped inside, locked the door, and plugged the phone into the audio console. Her hands were shaking, but her voice, when she whispered to herself, was steady. Time to wake up, Blacksburg. She hijacked the public address system just as the mayor began his opening remarks. The music died, replaced by a low, magnetic hiss. And then Eula's voice, heavy, rasping, and undeniable, boomed across the town square. Daniel Trent didn't die in no accident. The recording roared, the sound echoing off the brick buildings of Main Street. The crowd fell into a stunned, vacuum-like silence. The coal company executives on stage froze, their faces turning the color of ash as Eula began to name names, describing the bribes, the threats, and the night of the murder. The festive atmosphere vanished, replaced by a cold, sharpening realization. Martha Trent appeared at the side of the stage, her face a mask of horror. She tried to reach the sound booth, but Mabel stepped out, the phone still held high like a torch. The two women locked eyes in front of the gathered town and the local news cameras. "Stop it, Mabel!" Martha screamed, her voice cracking. But Mabel didn't stop. She stood her ground as the recording reached its crescendo. Martha broke then, the weight of 20 years of silence finally crushing her. She fell to her knees, sobbing, and confessed to the crowd that she had taken the hush money, that she had protected the business over the truth. The outrage of the townspeople was a physical wave, a low rumble that grew into a roar of collective fury. Sheriff Callahan tried to intervene, pushing through the crowd with his baton drawn. But he didn't reach the stage. The citizens of Blacksburg, the miners, the widows, the people who had been squeezed for decades, formed a human wall, blocking his path. They had heard enough. The sheriff realized then that his authority had evaporated, replaced by the honest, painful light of the truth. Mabel stood on the stage, looking out over the town she had fought so hard to save, and felt a strange, hollow peace. The secret was dead. The following hour was a blur of destruction. Mabel stood in the town square and watched the distant silhouette of the Trent funeral home as the demolition crew began their work. The Victorian house, with all its secrets and its blood money, crumbled into a heap of white wood and black dust. She lost her home, her business, and her material life in a single afternoon. But as the dust settled over Blacksburg, she felt the weight lift from her shoulders. The legacy of lies was gone. 6 months later, the air in Mabel's new apartment in Roanoke was fresh, smelling of coffee and the cinnamon she used in her morning oatmeal. It was a small space, but the light that came through the windows was clean. Lily was at the kitchen table, working on a math problem, her laughter no longer edged with fear. Mabel sat across from her, reviewing a flyer for the new support center she had opened, the Coal Widows Alliance. Funded by the settlement from the company's bankruptcy, it was a place where stories were told and silence was never an option. Martha was there too, working the front desk, finally earning the forgiveness she had spent a lifetime avoiding. Mabel looked at her daughter and smiled, a real, unburdened thing. The dead were finally at rest, and for the first time in her life, Mabel Trent was finally alive.